All right, let's talk about something that's become a real headache for a lot of businesses. Data transfers after Brexit. What used to be a simple, straight data highway is now, well, it's a completely new map. And it's got all these different rules and risks and routes, so we're going to dive in and try to make sense of this new world of cross-border data.
You know, this quote just nails it. It really gets to the core of the problem, because this isn't just about a bunch of new regulations. It's about having to rebuild the fundamental trust that let our data flow so freely in the first place. The old systems we all relied on, they're gone. And they've been replaced by something way more complicated that everyone's trying to figure out.
So here's our game plan for navigating this. First, we'll talk about the new data border Brexit created. Then we'll look at data flowing from Europe to the UK, and then from the UK out to the rest of the world. After that, we'll zoom out and look at the whole global compliance maze before we wrap up with a solid action plan you can actually use.
Okay, first up, Brexit's data border. The most important thing to get your head around is that the second the UK left the EU, its entire status in the data world changed, like overnight. And its new status is this: third country. From a legal point of view, under the EU's GDPR, that's the trigger for everything we're about to talk about. The UK is no longer inside the EEA's little data protection club. And that means any personal data you sent to the UK is now officially an international transfer, and it's subject to much, much stricter rules.
So what this all boils down to is that organizations are now stuck in what you could call a complex dance. You're not just playing by one set of rules anymore. You've got to somehow juggle the EU's GDPR, the UK's own version of GDPR, plus who knows what other privacy laws from around the globe. It really is like trying to keep 3 or 4 different balls in the air at once. Okay, let's trace our first route on the map: data moving from the European Union into the UK. For a long time, this was a huge question mark, a big point of uncertainty. But the EU did come up with a solution, for now anyway.
And that solution is something called an adequacy decision. This is basically the EU giving a country a big thumbs up. They're saying, yep, your data protection laws are strong enough that they're pretty much equivalent to ours. And when a country has adequacy, data can flow freely, almost like the good old days.
But here's where you see the gap between what it looks like and what it actually is. On the surface, yeah, the EU gave the UK an adequacy decision back in 2021, and that seems like a nice, stable bridge for data. But in reality, it's not a peace treaty. It's more like a temporary truce. It gets reviewed, and if the UK's laws start to drift too far from the EU's, poof, it could be gone. And that brings us to the million-dollar question for any business that relies on this data flow, right? What in the world do you do if that adequacy decision, that fragile little truce, suddenly gets ripped away? This is exactly why you need a plan B. If adequacy disappears, you have to be ready with other tools. We're talking about things like standard contractual clauses, or SCCs. They're basically pre-approved contract templates. Or binding corporate rules, BCRs, which are like an internal rulebook for big multinational companies. These things create a legal promise to protect the data, even without that adequacy decision. You absolutely cannot wait for the truce to end before you get these ready. Okay, so let's flip the map over and look at it from the other direction. What about data flowing out of the UK to the EU and to the rest of the world? This is where the UK is really starting to do its own thing. So for data going from the UK back to the EU, the UK basically returns the favor. It says, yep, the EU is adequate, data can flow. But, and this is a really important but, the UK's version of GDPR adds an extra hoop to jump through. It requires businesses to do something called a transfer risk assessment, or TRA. And that adds this whole extra layer of paperwork and diligence that you don't really see on the EU side. Now, what if you're sending data from the UK to a country that does not have an adequacy decision? Well, that process is even more buttoned up. A UK company has 2 main tools it can use.
either the UK's own specific contract, the International Data Transfer Agreement, the IDTA, or a special UK addendum you can tack on to the EU's contracts. And whichever one you pick, you must do that formal transfer risk assessment and document absolutely everything.
So let's zoom out for a second. When you start putting all these different pieces together, especially if you're a global company, you're not just following a single path. You are smack in the middle of a massive compliance maze. You know, for any company that operates in the UK, the EU, and other places, this is a huge challenge. You're dealing with what you could call dual legality. You have to keep both the EU and the UK happy at the same time. This means layers and layers of different documentation for every single data flow. And the really tricky part? You've got to make sure a person's rights over their own data are protected in the exact same way, no matter where in the world that data ends up. And let's be really clear about why this is so important. This isn't just about trying to avoid fines or ticking boxes on some form. It's not just a bureaucratic headache. At its absolute core, this whole thing is about maintaining trust. In today's economy, data relationships cross borders constantly, and proving you're compliant, well, that's the language we use to build that trust. So that brings us to the final and I think most important section. Now that we've kind of looked at the map and all of its challenges, we need a compass, right? Something to help us actually get through it. So here is your action plan. Think of this 6-step playbook as your guide. First up, due diligence. You have to be regularly auditing all your data transfer mechanisms. Then, documentation. Keep clear, auditable records of everything. Step 3 is about choosing your safeguards and actually applying them in a meaningful way, not just as a paper exercise. Fourth, you got to be constantly monitoring for legal changes in both the UK and the EU. All of this means your legal, compliance, and IT teams need to be perfectly aligned. And finally, the big one, privacy by design. Bake this stuff into your systems from the very beginning. I want to leave you with this thought. It's so easy to think of data as just an asset, like currency that you trade. But a much better way to think about it is as a covenant, a kind of quiet, sacred promise between a person and the company they're trusting with their information. And when you see it that way, it shifts your perspective from just a legal chore to a real ethical responsibility. And that leads to my final question for you to think about. When you really look at how your own organization handles cross-border data, is it just a checklist, a list of tedious tasks you have to get through to be compliant? Or is it a thoughtful, disciplined choreography where every single move is designed to protect data, to maintain trust, and to navigate this incredibly complex new world with real skill?